Welcome to This Week in Creationism, episode number 6. This is where we look at the headlines in creationism from the past week. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and today we're going to talk about Ken Ham saying no to space rock Sodom destruction theory. We're going to ask, what's in a name? Specifically, what do we call young earth creationists? Or should I be calling them young earth creationists? Todd would ask that question when he writes a blog post, What Am I? And he reviews all the different names that young earth creationists have called themselves over the past 30, 40 years. And I think it's rather instructive, so we'll take a look at that. So let's get started on those two stories. First of all, I think you'd have to be hiding under a rock not to have heard the story recently about this giant rock that scientists believe came crashing through the atmosphere 3,600 years ago above a small town in the Jordan Valley in Israel and blew up in the air. It's what's called an air burst. So the pressure inside from the heat exploded that rock, creating a massive shock wave that the authors of this article I'm going to show you in a moment believe melted the ground, literally melted the sand in the walls of the buildings and on pottery. An incredibly destructive event that they believe destroyed an entire town of 8,000 people and a variety of small villages and other towns within a good 15 to 20 mile radius around this location. And the authors speculate that this might be the event that etched itself in the memory of people at that time and therefore inspired the biblical story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So I wondered, how would Ken Ham, Answers in Genesis, and other creationist organizations respond to this particular story? And I speculated about this on Facebook, a few other places, and had some discussion with folks, and we couldn't really decide. They could go one of two ways, right? Yeah, this is proof that Sodom and Gomorrah really happened, and the Bible is once again vindicated, right? This really happened, a massive destructive event. The other direction they could go is, no, this is some other event. It doesn't quite fit the story in the Bible, and the Bible certainly isn't inspired by memories that other people have of other events, and so they didn't make up this story to try to explain some natural event. It was a supernatural event, and because it was a supernatural event, we shouldn't be trying to explain it in this fashion. Well, they go the second direction. I have to admit, I'm a little surprised. Now, what will be very fascinating is to see, will all the other young earth creationist organizations fall in line with Answers in Genesis? Will they also say, nope, no way, this description is something that happened separately from Sodom and Gomorrah and doesn't have anything to do with Sodom and Gomorrah? I'll talk a little bit about why they think that it isn't Sodom and Gomorrah and give some of my own reflections upon this at the same time. So here's their in Ken Ham's blog. He has a post. Now at the end of the blog it says it was written with the help of others at his organization. That's just code for somebody else wrote this and I'm posting it on my blog. But I approve of this message, right? So did a space rock destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? And I've already given away the punchline, and he's very strongly, adamantly saying no. But why? Let's see. All right. So first of all, this is the reference that he uses in his blog post. So this is what he tells his audience to, they could check this out if they want to see a simple version of, this is the popular article that goes with the scientific article that came out in Nature Scientific Reports, I think. And I actually I have another video that you could check out in which I talk about the evidence from the Nature article itself, Nature Scientific Reports article itself, and kind of go over what are some of the reasons they believe that this was a cataclysmic event caused by an extraterrestrial rock. So check that out for that evidence. But this article gives you the headline that I think that Ham is responding to. A giant space rock demolished an ancient Middle Eastern city and everyone in it, possibly inspiring the biblical story of Sodom. Now, it's this word inspiring that I think that Ken Ham and others in Answers in Genesis are reeling from. All right, I think that they don't like that word inspiring, and I think that's jading their ability to maybe look at this particular evidence a little more dispassionately. And so let's take a look at that. They've also, not only did Ken Ham put this on his blog, but during their Answers News program, they addressed this topic as well. And that's where I saw it first. Did asteroids destroy Sodom? And they kind of laughed and joked about it. But a couple things I drew from that. One is they seemed very, they seemed to think that the evidence was compelling, that a very significant event happened, that it very well could be an asteroid that exploded and destroyed that city. They weren't skeptical of the actual scientific paper. The fact they called it really, they seemed to think it was good evidence that actually happened. What they object to is, and I find this quite illuminating. They say it can't be the event that caused Sodom and Gomorrah because the timing is wrong, right? It's only 3,600 years ago. That would be the time of when the Israelites were in Egypt, rather than the time of Sodom and Gomorrah or during Abrahamic times, which would be several hundred years before that. And so they look at it and they say, look, this happened 3,600 years ago. That doesn't line up with the timing of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, what's interesting about that is they don't bat an eyelash at the timing of the secular dating of this. The secular dating comes from carbon-14 dating. Right? They took seeds of a plant that were embedded in materials found in getting my stories mixed up. That's human footprints in New Mexico. But they did find that it was carbon-14 dating, but they also have several other forms of dating, thermoluminescence, and I believe one other form of dating in there that all coincide, but it's mostly carbon-14 dating, coincide or coalesce around that 3,600 year age. It's actually 3,610 to like 3,660 or something like that, a 50-year range that they're quite confident that this event falls into. You see why I'm perplexed by this? If secular scientists give an age for other things, they say, like, well, how do you know how? I mean, there's all kinds of problems with carbon-14 dating. There could have been contamination. How do you know how you're interpreting that? They also argue in many places that, like, there have been acceleration of nuclear decay rates, and so therefore you can't back calculate directly to a date because it's not I'm losing my math terms right now. It can't be just directly back calculated. And, they would give all kinds of excuses for why you can't trust the dating methods. So why not just do that here? Why not say, yes, this was a dramatic event. It occurred right in the area around the Dead Sea. They got their date wrong, because we already know from, 1,000 times we've told our audience before, you can't trust those dates, but the location's about right. And the type of destruction is pretty darn similar to the description from the Bible. So why not just say that they got their dates wrong? Your audience is going to accept that particular explanation. Well, it's more than the date. I think they decided it wasn't the case right from the get-go. I don't think, again, like I said, they don't like this idea here in blue here. Let's read that first, and I'll come back around to this. Also, the destruction of the cities, as well as other cities in Adamah and Zillam on the plain, wasn't a story inspired by some naturalistic event. It was a divinely ordained destruction. Now, why can't a divinely ordained destruction be caused by what is an apparent natural event? We have many other instances in the Bible of events that occurred that you would say those are divinely appointed. They're not coincidences, right? They are events that happen at a particular time in a particular place that was divinely organized. And so if a space rock is God's method, all right, that he would employ it at that very moment in which he had, in which Lot and his wife are running away from this town, why can't that be a mechanism that God employs? After all, the biblical text talks about sulfur raining down and talks about the fires and talks about a variety of things. Those are natural things as well, even if they're caused by God to occur. I just don't understand the lack of willingness to associate a potential event that we now know about with a description which is written by a primitive society in terms of their perceptions of what's happening. Anyway, no. Sodom and Gomorrah were not destroyed by an asteroid that inspired the biblical account. They were destroyed just as the Bible states. And that's a reminder to make sure that we judge people's interpretation of past events from the foundation of God's word. If the interpretation doesn't match, then it's wrong. The city's destruction and the continuing desolation of their former location is a reminder to God that God always judges sin. Now, they point out that this city that was destroyed isn't in the spot that they think that Sodom could be. Now, there's lots of disputes about where Sodom could be, and no one can say for sure they know where it is. And so they can't simply rely on maybe some other articles that they've written in which they speculate where Sodom is. And because of where they speculate it is not in the exact same spot that this particular destruction occurred, doesn't mean that they're not wrong about their other articles, that this could actually be the location of Sodom. And there's several other pieces of evidence they mention in here that just don't quite fit. But I think most of those they're not deal breakers. Now, I'm not saying that I am convinced that this should be directly equated with the event that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. All right. And from what we learned from the Bible, it could be completely different events. But as I explored in the other video, this is an event that even answers in Genesis admit happened. They can't really deny the evidence that a cataclysmic event occurred that literally melted the surface of the ground, vaporized the upper surface of the Dead Sea, creating a rain of salt, that covered the plain around the Dead Sea, making it uninhabitable for hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards. Now, if that happened hundreds of years after Sodom and Gomorrah, it's rather intriguing that there isn't any, and that's, I'll be interested to see if others can find evidence in other literature of this. But why is there no memory of this event that we have recorded? The Sodom and Gomorrah event would have been very dramatic as well. And you could say we have a report of that in the biblical text, right? We have a report of this dramatic event happening in this region on the Dead Sea. If there was another one that sounds, from all descriptions in this literature, was incredibly destructive, why don't we have a memory of that as well? It just seems like they're making it a little harder than it has to be. Now they need to find an explanation for how this other event occurred right there in the Promised Land, with hardly anyone noticing it or anyone making note of it at all. Well, let's move on. I'm sure we'll come back to this because I'll be shocked if Creation Ministries International and Institutes for Creation Research can let that story go and not comment it on themselves. And so will they do the same thing? Will they take the same approach that Answers in Genesis has taken? My bet is that they won't. I think there'll be some diversity of views among creationists. I don't think they're going to be able to come down on one side on this particular topic. Simply because it's not really that clear, and you could make arguments in a variety of different directions. Now, let's move on to Todd Wood. All right, Todd Wood's blog is a delight to read. I really enjoy his insights. into the mind of creationism and his willingness to be very forthright about what he's thinking. What he the things that he struggles with, the things that he's sure about, and the questions he has. It's really great to read his material. And so he wrote this article, What Am I Again? And this is a follow-up to another article he wrote. There was the question of, what am I? What I should be called. And he says, every couple of years, I spend a little time trying to figure out what to call myself and my position. What exactly is the name for my position? And he wrote this very helpful article in which he goes down all the different names that creationists have called themselves. I'm not talking about pejorative names that others have given to creationists. I'm talking about how do creationists refer to themselves, and what kinds of names have they thought best describe their own position. And so he goes through this list of things. So he has neo-creationist, the new creationist, and that's a Kurt Wise thing from the 90s. So how about scientific creationism? So I think some of you who are older or, my age probably maybe think of it as scientific creationist or creation science, because that was a word that was used very frequently, especially with institutes for creation science, right? Creation science, that it was very focused on the science side of trying to come up with scientific evidence in support of scriptures, but sometimes actually even really not even referring to scriptures, but trying to get people to just believe in a young earth from a scientific perspective as sort of like your way of getting people into then saying, hey, now that you believe the world is young, look at this. The Bible actually confirms that. And so that should give you pause to think about the truths of scripture. Biblical creationism. Personally, I'm not sure why this hasn't caught on or why different organizations haven't pushed this a little bit stronger, because it's a great apologetics tool just to call oneself a biblical creationist, because then it sounds like, wow, I'm the real biblical creationist, as opposed to others who don't really believe the Bible. I always object to young earth creationists calling themselves biblical creationists, because they do it in a sense of, we're the real biblical creationists, we're the ones that really believe the Bible. And I would call myself a biblical creationist. I'm completely comfortable calling myself that. I think it is a much broader category than just young earth creationist. Should be called biblical creationist. Biblical literalist, which kind of captures the sense of we're reading the text in the literal, common sense way of 6-day creation, 6 literal 24-hour days. And so that very accurately describes, in young earth creationists' mind, their mindset that they are biblical literalist. Again, I would call myself a literalist as well. I mean, I take the text literally, in the sense that I take it to mean what it literally means to mean. What else do we have here? Let's keep going down this list. I'm skipping a few. I think I've already skipped a few here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, well, you have to go to his article because I don't have the rest of them here. There's a couple others in there, which I don't remember. But let's get down to the one I really wanted to highlight, new creationism. And hey, I got myself a mention in here. This is from Joel Duff. And also from Paul Garner's book, right? Paul Garner has a book called New Creationism. And, he says it's a little bit of a reboot of Kurt Wise's neo-creationism, and I agree. There's an aspect of that in the way that I described the new creationist. And as he says here, because Joel thinks that there's a new wave of creationist researchers who are markedly different than other creationist advocates. And yeah, I've written a series of blog articles in which I have, I have hypothesized, I had this hypothesis that there is a kind of a different breed of creationist out there, up and coming, not that they're all young, but a different way of thinking about creation apologetics and a different attitude. And I call that new creationism, although it's there's no clear break between what I'm calling new creationist and what I call sort of traditional creationism. He says I'm not wild about drawing a line in the sand, and I don't consider it drawing a line in the sand at all, but I understand why he doesn't want to take on that name given the kind of connotation that I gave it. I think it's a good connotation for him, but he doesn't want to mark himself off as being that different from other creationists, because I called him one of the new creationists, along with Paul Garner and others. Like he said, I think it makes a fine book title, but what does it really mean? Does it actually tell me what's new? He might be right. I had a tough time kind of putting any specific definitions on that term myself. To me, it's more of a feeling that there is a different breed of creationists out there, ones that I find more engaging, more willing to have civil discussion and conversation with. And that's sort of what I like and what I think is different about new creationists. And then you have things like intelligent interventionist. I mean, you can come up with all kinds of words that actually probably are more descriptive of creationism, but they're not catchy, right? So you have to have a catchy name. I mean, like, I don't like old Earth creationists. It kind of gives an idea of what somebody believes, and OEC, and it's just in the literature, and it'd be hard to move away from that particular term, but I'm sure we could come up with a better descriptive term. It just wouldn't be as easy to remember and identify with. And then lastly, he has young Earth evolutionists, and this is something that that is sort of a problem within young Earth creationism, is that you have various views of and squabbles within about some creationists who think that other creationists have gone too far in terms of accepting evolution. So they kind of have a pejorative name about other creationists. So this is creationists. Yes, non-creationists have called creationists young Earth evolutionists. I have myself. I called them YEEs at times, but even creationists have called other creationists young Earth evolutionists, and they don't mean it in a nice way in their case. So he ends up with, so young age creationist, which I've heard Todd would refer to himself as many times, and I kind of like that term, and I try to use it on my blog some, but I often slip, as I have right here in this talk right now, into young Earth creationist. Like you said, those are good enough for him. They seem to say most of what needs to be said and identify who he is, and put him into a group of other people he's comfortable being with. And so young Earth creationist it is. I don't see that changing anytime soon. All right, so that's a helpful list if you ever wondered what the various names that creationists have called themselves and what the definitions of each one of those terms are, or at least a rough idea of what individuals meant by that. This is just a reminder that I have written a number of articles that I've published on my blog about my impressions of creationism this year. Sort of think of it as not this week in creationism, but this year in creationism. What do I see as the big trends in creationism? And so here's a series of those articles. The Dawn of the New Creationists, I named it. And I talk about the characteristics of the new creationist, and I made several videos also in which I discussed who these creationists are, what they're up to, and how I think that they're the wave of the future in creationism, and so something to keep track of. And you'll see that as we go through this Week in Creationism series, I will point out some of the differences between creationists and how and what kind of inroads different groups are making to influencing each other and how they're changing over time. So I think by looking at this every week, it helps sort of see the dynamic nature of controversial issues within creationism and how even creationists themselves are grappling with those issues, and they don't agree with each other, and they are changing and shifting over time. Not that their core principles haven't really changed at all in terms of their core commitments, but there are many different, I guess, methods and apologetic methods within creationism that have seen a lot of change over especially the last 5 years, I think. Anyway, that's this week in creationism. A lot going on, and I fully expect to see responses to some of the major scientific discoveries made in the last couple days or reported in the last week coming out in the creationist literature in the near future. So I'm sure we'll be covering those in more detail coming up. Thanks again for watching, and if this content was at all useful, maybe hit the subscribe button and you can find out what happens next week in creationism. Bye-bye.